Strings attached by invisible armor and lavender narwhal. Summary. So, as much as the thought of pretending to be dopily in love with Brad fills Beckett with a weird sickly feeling she can't quite put her finger on, she has an obligation to put the effort in. Because Beckett's a great friend. Because she never says no to a prank. And because Will the Boimler who didn't come back definitely deserves it. Marinler agrees to pose as Boimler's girlfriend at a Titan reunion party in an effort to outshine Will after his big promotion. With ample practice, a lot of lying, and several glasses of champagne. What could possibly go wrong? Brad Boimler has never been one to get straight to the point. He has a tendency to tiptoe around his intentions for a while, fiddling with the cuffs of his sleeves and droning on about barely tangential topics, as if he's hoping that, as long as he keeps talking, the words he wants to say will somehow find their way out on their own. It's a facet of him that Beckett's become accustomed to over the years, much like his incessant need to follow the rules, or his ridiculous speed walk, or the way he always orders his oatmeal extra mild. For all her efforts, Beckett's found that the only time he ever actually manages to be direct is when he's angry. But unfortunately, she's a bit overdue on this month's plans to piss him off, which is probably why she's been sitting here daydreaming for the past 8 billion years while she waits for him to spit out what he wants. And obviously it wouldn't mean anything he's saying. Beckett tears a strip off her napkin. Now that she thinks about it, it really has been a while since she's messed with him. And it's totally fine if you don't want to. Maybe she's growing as a person. But I owe you like 7 holodeck slots. Or maybe he just hasn't been as torpy as usual. And if you think about it, it would kind of just be like when you were my +1 for the Starbase 25 party, Brad says. Except that it's actually kind of making up for it because your name will be on the list this time. No harm in staying on top of it, though. Beckett wads up the piece of crinkled paper and rolls it between her fingers. She could always go the route of changing his name to Bradley Bumford in the ship's systems again. Or she could replace all his fancy hair gel with mayonnaise. Or maybe she could program the replicator to make him a uniform that's permanently creased so that he'd never be able to get the wrinkles out. Yeah, that'd keep him up for days. And we almost definitely won't drown in positron-flavored bubble bath this time. Well, I mean, no guarantees. There's just something about the way little things like that get him all riled up at the way his ears go red and his forehead crinkles. And he's so incapable of hiding the fact she's pushing all his buttons. It would almost be cute if, he wasn't him. Well, Beckett finally wakes from her stupor, and she glances up from the now cold dregs of her Roctagino. Huh? Brad's face flushes pink. I know it's weird, and stupid, and weird, but I kind of really need you. And he knocks his knuckles together, please. Beckett feels her stomach twist. Brad's eyes as wide as tiny saucer sections, one of the tufts of his hair practically drooping in desperation. He sounds about as pitiful as she's ever heard him, which, given everything about him, is a pretty remarkable feat. It's enough to make Beckett almost wonder if she should have been listening. Fuck, she says. Okay, hang on. She squeezes her eyes shut, trying to mentally rewind on his rant, like how people in the Stone Ages used to do with those holo-movies they kept in plastic rectangles. A few snippets come back interspersed with visions of herself dumping itch nanites into his underwear drawer. Right. So, Will the Betrayer... Promotion, Brad supplies helpfully. Yeah. Uh-huh, Beckett says. She opens one eye. And so now he's, having a big party for himself. It's not a party for him, Brad interjects. The Titan's having a reunion party, where he just happens to be receiving honors. Fine, says Beckett, opening her other eye. And so he called you to brag about it because... Clone stuff, nods Brad. He's a complete asshole, she finishes. Brad rolls his eyes, but he nods again. So what? Okay, Beckett says, flicking her napkin ball across the table, the words spilling out of her mouth, as they so often do, before she's actually really thought about them. And so now you need me, your best and objectively hottest friend. She eyes Brad pointedly, though he has the good sense not to challenge her, to pretend to be your girlfriend at said party, because She stops partially because her mouth has suddenly gone weirdly dry, probably the shitty replicator coffee she hasn't been drinking, but mostly because Brad winces audibly at the word girlfriend and then buries his head in his hands. "Because I sort of already told him you were," he mumbles, but I swear it was only because he was going on and on about his stupid award, and I just wanted to seem like I had something going for me. It just kind of slipped out, and you don't have to, but... He looks up at her, desperation etched into his face. "Please." Beckett chews the inside of her cheek. A part of her is tempted to quirk an eyebrow, smirk, and say something to the tune of, "And I'm going to sacrifice my dignity and pretend to be in love with you because..." But this seems a little harsh, given she's sacrificed her dignity for, way less. And pulling an elaborate prank to piss off Brad's asshole brother actually sounds kind of incredible. Another part of her wants to break into a grin and slap him hard on the back, with a hearty, "Boim's fake dating to piss off your clone? I must be finally rubbing off on you." But he seems so fragile right now that she's a little worried a single slap would shatter him, and then Ransom'd probably assign her an extra shift to vacuum him up off the floor. And then there's a third part of Beckett that wants to punch him in the face. This one's not for any real reason. It's just an instinct she has sometimes. Brad is still looking at her with his big, sad eyes, like he's a pathetic purple puppy dog, and Beckett hums as she swishes around the thick foam in her mug, drawing out him for as long as she can, while Brad watches from the edge of his seat. He looks at her pleadingly for a long moment, then lets his face fall to stare resolutely at a crumb on the tabletop, his one defeated tuft of hair swinging dangerously close to his untouched Mugato milk steamer. Beckett sets her mug down with a thud. 7 holodeck slots, huh? Brad's face shoots up again, like a bean sprout that's had just the right amount of sun. Or something. Beckett's an ensign, not a horticulturalist. 12? I'll give you 12. She pretends to mull this over with a sip of her Roctagino and regrets it. It's still cold. Brad grits his teeth. 15? 17, Beckett says, propping an elbow up on the back of the booth. "And you buy me dinner, since I'm your girlfriend and all." She has to bite back a grin as Brad squirms visibly in his seat. "I can't buy you dinner," he says. "We don't use money." "Fine." She waves a hand. "So replicate me dinner." "You can't replicate your own dinner." "That's not the point." "So you just want me to walk up to the replicator and order your food for you?" Beckett crosses her arms. "Do you treat all your partners this way?" Brad groans and collapses back onto the table, but there's an air of relief to his expression now. His hair seems to have regained its usual ability to defy artificial gravity. "Hey," Beckett says, "do you want to piss off your asshole doppelganger or not?" "Fine," he says. 17 holodeck slots, and I say the word Hasperit to a computer for you. "You've got a deal," Beckett says, grabbing his hand and taking pleasure in drawing out the shake. "Too bad, though. I totally would have done it for free." It takes about 45 minutes for him to start talking to her again after that, which is also, apparently, the amount of time it takes him to drink a fucking mug of warm milk. By the time he's gotten over his very immature huff, they're on their way back to their bunks, and Beckett's made it through the initial 7 stages of mouth dryness to tackle the plan head-on. She has developed a weird, creeping feeling in the pit of her stomach, but she's successfully avoiding it through the tried-and-true strategy of not shutting the fuck up, which Brad's ungrateful vow of silence has made even easier than usual. Acting's all in the motivation, she's saying. You have to really believe it for the audience to believe you, or else they'll just see right through you. So, there are a few things we'll need to establish to make sure this thing is convincing. Convincing? Brad says. Beckett waves a hand. Oh yeah, these kinds of schemes can go downhill fast. But you'll be pleased to know this is not my first fake dating rodeo. You'll definitely probably not embarrass yourself in front of all your old friends. Who have you fake dated before? Brad asks faintly. Fake dating rule number 1. Don't fake kiss and tell. My point is, I'm awesome and you're lucky to have me. She pauses for Brad to agree. He doesn't, which is rude. But anyway, Backstory. Beckett stops walking and swivels on her heels, cornering Brad against the wall. So, who do you need me to be? A bright-eyed young ensign who thinks you hang the stars in the sky? A sultry vixen with a dark past but a heart of gold? She leans forward. Ooh, do you want me to be jealous? I'm so good at being jealous. Well, Brad squeaks slowly, like he's still processing how incredibly talented and generous Beckett happens to be. He's me. So he's met you before, so just be you, I guess. Beckett tips backward on her heels. Ugh, lame. But like a version of you that likes me, Brad offers. Hey, I do like you, Beckett says. She accompanies this with a hefty punch to his shoulder for effect, which for some reason doesn't seem to help. Brad sighs, rubbing his arm with the opposite hand. Okay, a version of you that acts like you like me, he says. And that you know, he looks at the floor, a faint blush creeping into his cheeks. Likes me. Beckett resists the urge to ask him when he plans on graduating middle school. Got it, she says. So, opposite day. Can my name be Beckett Barriner? Brad groans. Forget it. This was a terrible idea. I'll just call him up and admit that I'm a liar and a loser and... Beckett sighs. No. Hey. She reaches out an arm to put a hand on his shoulder, making sure to be a little gentler this time. I've got your back. Look. And, with the air of a changeling about to absolutely nail charades, she brings her hands to her chest, plasters on her most simpering smile, and says in a falsetto tone, Anything for my precious boyfriend, But before she can get the name out, she feels a sudden lurch in her stomach, and barely has time to pivot to the side before she retches violently onto the floor. A passing Tellarite crewman shoots her a look of disgust. So, when she's wiped the tears from her eyes and has managed to stand herself upright again, she finds Brad staring at her with a look of utter despair etched onto his face. Okay, fine. I see your point. I'll work on it. Beckett does work on it. A lot. Beckett's biggest issue, well, one of her biggest issues, because she's extremely complicated, thank you very much, is that she can't really half-ass anything. Sure, she can half-ass work, but only because she's whole-assing half-assing it, in a very noble attempt to stick it to the man. And her mom. So, as much as the thought of pretending to be dopily in love with Brad fills Beckett with a weird sickly feeling she can't quite put her finger on, she has an obligation to put the effort in. Because Beckett's a great friend. Because she never says no to a prank. And because Will the Boimler who didn't come back definitely deserves it. Brad, on the other hand, seems unusually unconcerned with preparing himself for the whole ordeal. You'd think he'd want to practice pretending to be in love with her a bit too, seeing as they're both going to have to play the part. And did he star in an Enterprise Children's Theater production of My Fair Benzite when he was 9? Unlikely, but he stays well away from her for the whole week leading up to the party. Almost like the idea of Beckett carefully studying how to fawn over him makes him a little bit uncomfortable. Go figure. So Beckett takes to doing it alone. She studies all his logs, poring over them for funny stories or redeeming quirks she can drop into conversation, with the added bonus that Brad's droning monologues about his opinions on Regulation 52 manage to put her right to sleep. She tries to think about him when she's at work, or exercising, or running for her life, usually all three until she's trained herself to induce a blush on cue, and she practices saying, my boyfriend, Boimler, in the mirror, in the shower, in the empty turbo lift over and over again until she doesn't gag, and it rolls off her tongue instead, which actually doesn't take that long, considering. Beckett even stops by her mom's office once or twice, just to make sure they're still on course to meet up with the Titan. The crew would usually be alerted to any major navigation change, of course, but there's no harm in double-checking, because Beckett's just that good of a best friend. I don't suppose, Carol asks shrewdly, after Beckett strolls into her office unannounced for the third time this week, that all this checking has anything to do with your friend Boimler and the Titan reunion party? Something squirms in Beckett's chest, and she does her best to look bemused. What could possibly make you think that? He's already submitted your leave request. That weasel, And Riker called me, Carol continues, raising an eyebrow in a manner that's way less cool than when Beckett does it. He seemed to have some ideas about your status as Mr. Boimler's guest. Beckett crosses her arms. And I assume you're alleging that this is a strictly platonic trip? I don't see how that's any of your business. The corner of Carol's mouth twitches upwards. It's just that I'm remembering the two of you sneaking off my ship together to try to get into the command conference party a few months ago. He was my ticket in, Beckett says sharply. Besides, as if you didn't try to sneak into a command conference party or two when you were an ensign. I did, Carol says slowly, setting her pad down and leaning forward to clasp her hands together on her desk. With your father? You. All I'm saying, Carol says, as Beckett pretends to dry heave onto the floor, is that you could do a lot worse than him. She pauses with a grimace. In fact, you have done a lot worse than him. A lot worse, Beckett. I think he's a good influence on you. Beckett straightens herself up. I'm doing a favor for a friend. She spits, turning on her heels. This is why I don't talk to you. Beckett, Carol calls after her. As Beckett marches out the door, I approved the request. Whatever. Beckett's still stewing when Brad finally joins her for breakfast the next morning. He slinks into the booth across from her, knocking his knuckles together and clenching his teeth like he's just come back from a climate-accurate holo simulation of Andoria, which is impossible because he's already given her all of his holodeck slots. So, he says tentatively, peering up at her, Are you still up for it? Absolutely, Beckett says firmly. Brad offers a very insulting look of disbelief. And you're not. You won't change your mind. Because I can give you my next shore leave too. Or pretend to ransom that I didn't see you buttering his barbell. Or, Beckett sighs and pushes her plate to the side. Oh, hey, I'm totally capable of pretending to be into you, okay? I did all my homework. This gets her another pointed glance, which she chooses to ignore for the sake of not having to defend her capacity for academic achievement to the universe's most pretentious teacher's pet. Hell, I even reached out to Barb to see what she saw in you. Oh, Brad says, perking up a little. Something acidic stirs in Beckett's gut. And how did that go? Beckett takes a thoughtful bite of toast. Well, the bad news is that she was mostly into you because of the parasite, so it was kind of a dead end. Brad groans. And the good news? He says weakly. She and I are on for Paris's squares next month. Brad slumps so low into his seat that you'd think he'd descended through several layers of the Earth's crust. If, they were anywhere near Earth. Oh, God. Beckett gestures with her toast, scattering crumbs across the tabletop. Don't worry, I can take her. The death rates for that game are blown way out of proportion. Oh, God, Brad says again, putting his head in his hands. We're not going to be able to pull this off. He's going to realize I'm a liar, and he's going to hold it over my head forever, and I'm going to look like a joke on the ship I got demoted from, in front of all my ex-friends. His voice reaches a pitch previously believed to be outside the range of human capability. In front of Riker. Beckett reaches across the table to rescue another tuft of his hair from imminent drowning, this time in a bowl of uneaten Udderberry yogurt. Hey, seriously, don't worry. I've totally got this. Have I ever let you down? Yes, Brad cries. I mean when it's not on purpose. He offers a grunt into the table. My point is, Beckett says, we're going to make the weirdly successful clone version of you feel like targ shit, okay? She puts 2 fingers to her badge. Ensign's honor. Brad gives her a doubtful look, but, eventually, he sits up again and nods. Okay then, Beckett says, swiping up both their plates with one hand and holding the other out to him. He doesn't take it. Let's do this, babe. So, Brad calls awkwardly, are you ready? They're in the mercifully empty beta shift hallway, Brad waiting not so patiently on his bed. Beckett changing into her formal wear around the corner. Normally, she'd be fine. Stripping down right in front of him, showering one shower apart, is really the extent of the privacy you can get as an ensign. But Beckett's always kind of had a flair for the dramatic. A fancy dress and a fake first date seems like the perfect opportunity for a big reveal. Or maybe some fake modesty. Whichever works. I'm not bailing on you, if that's what you're worrying about. Beckett straightens her dress again, taking in her reflection from the large window that overlooks their bunks. There isn't much to it. She's wearing her hair down tonight, like she usually does on formal occasions, when there's less risk of running, or fighting, or getting it tangled in some possessive alien bush, and her ears are studded with hoops and silver stars. The dress itself isn't anything special. Well, actually, it is a long, satiny black cocktail thing whose replicator pattern she's been saving for a party just like this. But it doesn't feel that special, which, she guesses, is kind of the point. After all, it's not like tonight is actually an occasion. It's not like it's anything other than a glorified away mission with fewer regulations, a play for which she's been cast as the supporting role. It's not like, all this week, there's been any reason for her to have butterflies in her stomach or swoopy thoughts spiraling inside her head. And it's not like she has any reason to want things to be special, because tonight, Beckett's just playing someone else. She has to save the real looks for nights she's actually expecting to get some. Not that she would want to get some tonight, or that she's even thinking about that, or, well, shut up. You get it. The point is, Beckett looks hot, but like an acceptable amount of hot. No need to go overboard just for a prank, which is something she never thought she'd say. And you're like sure you're still up for this? Brad says, because it's not too late to... With a roll of her eyes and a final adjustment, Beckett steps out into the larger hallway to find Brad, as expected, waiting for her in his ivory and gold dress scant. He looks how he usually looks in a scant, nervous and sweaty, mostly but more so, in a way that isn't awful but is definitely him. Beckett briefly finds herself wondering if Will be wearing the same thing, and if so, how she's supposed to tell them apart. Maybe Will has an evil glint in his eye or something. That'd help. Brad glances up from where he's fumbling with his cufflinks, delta-shaped, obviously, and she watches his eyes tentatively scan her, in that Boimler way that sometimes makes her wonder if he's actually just a purple-striped tricorder that some malicious Q decided to bestow with an anxiety disorder, and then turn into a man. He says after a few moments, letting an open cuff fall from his hand. You look, good. Somewhere deep inside her, Beckett feels a weird, uncharacteristic, and totally meaningless pang of something. Fortunately for her, and unfortunately for her liver, Beckett's never paid much heed to what her internal organs have to say. Instead, she rolls her eyes again, and marches over to help him with his cuffs. Very convincing. For some reason, this doesn't seem to make Brad any less nervous. He fidgets wordlessly as she approaches, and then fixates on the speckled floor until she's finished straightening his sleeves. At least once tonight's over, he can stop being so weird. Although, he's him, so maybe not. You actually don't clean up so bad yourself, she says, nudging him and making sure to run a hand through his meticulously gelled hair. Brad finally takes his eyes off his feet. You think so? Oh yeah, Beckett says, taking a step back to admire her handiwork. I think we actually make a pretty convincing pair. To a bunch of strangers who don't know that I have standards. This, at least, gets her that familiar huff. Oh, great. Thanks. Beckett grins. Hey, rule number 1 of fake dating me. I get to tease my boyfriend. You already tease me, Brad says. Exactly. That's how you know I'm perfect for the part. Brad snorts. Fine. Besides, wouldn't that be rule number 2? Okay, rule number 2 of fake dating me. Beckett says, I get to tease my boyfriend, and I'm not your real boyfriend. That spark of something stirs again, and Beckett claps her hands together. Not with that attitude, she says. It's almost like you don't want this to be convincing. I could just call Will. Brad springs up from his seat, barely missing concussing himself on the underneath of her bunk. Nope. That's okay, so, should we? He beckons towards the stretch of hallway. After you. Brad holds out his elbow awkwardly, and Beckett, after a moment, takes it and lets him lead her out into the hall. They've only made it a few steps before he grumbles, I don't suppose there's a rule 3 I should know about. Beckett stops in her tracks. Looking back, she isn't sure what makes her say it. It's impulsive, maybe. Like everything that comes out of her mouth these days, as if her tongue has a separate brain that's really fucking tired of her regular brain's shit. Or maybe it's because the time is here, and it's been a long week of practicing, and she's just a little frazzled by it all. Beckett wets her lips, trying to phrase it as a casual statement, as if the thought has just come to her, as if it hasn't been nibbling at the edges of her consciousness for months. Actually, yeah. Brad stops too, and turns to look at her, which makes her heart beat faster in her chest. Beckett says, if we're going to pull this off, you can't keep calling me by my last name. It's a dead giveaway. She bites her tongue, closing her eyes and waiting a beat before continuing. I mean, have you ever called me by my first name? Brad's silent for a long moment, staring at her, or maybe playing dead. Then he opens his stupid mouth. Of course I have. He lies. Beckett's eyes narrow, the awkwardness seeping away into the carpet. You have? Yep, Brad says. Really? Uh-huh. When? All the time. Beckett settles her hands on her hips. All right, then say it. Brad goes pale. I what? Say it. You... Brad looks like he'd rather be cleaning out Tiana's secret litter box. You'd think referring to your best friend of an undisclosed number of years by their literal name would rank easier than things like risky away missions, or bridge duty during battle, or, abandoning Beckett Mariner to serve some shitty dream job on the Titan. But then again, Mr. Protocol Trump's fun has never really had his priorities straight. He opens his mouth again, contorts it around for a few agonizing moments. Beckett has the horrifying thought she might have to kiss that later, and then he finally manages to sputter out a pitiful, Becky? Not my name. So, it's not like Beckett finds it hard to call him Bradward, mostly because it's a great way to make fun of him. But still, you'd think the idiot could at least try. There's not really any reason for it to have been bothering her so much, except that maybe it feels like lately she's been putting all the work in, while he avoids her for no reason. And with all this fake dating hubbub, little things like first name bases are at the forefront of her mind. She also just wants to piss off Will as royally as she can, which is going to require absolute perfection in the fake dating game. Bradward just needs to pull his weight. Brad's still sputtering wordlessly, looking completely ridiculous. And Beckett is just about to turn away and tell him he's going to have to practice in the turbo lift when he finally says it. Out of nowhere, just loud enough for her to hear. Beckett. She almost has to catch her breath. If she's honest with herself, Beckett had been expecting something awkward. Choked, guttural maybe, judging by the other sounds escaping from his throat. But it isn't like that at all. Brad says it softly, gently, like her name is a treasured piece of pottery he doesn't want to break. But it's natural, too. Water over clay, a porcelain bowl he's sculpted to fit the palm of his own hand. Beckett's had a lot of names over the years, Freeman. Mariner. Hey, get back here, you. But never one that's felt quite so intimate. It's nice. In a we're definitely going to piss off Will kind of way. Beckett swallows down any other weird, floaty feelings, trying to creep up from her stomach. They're just nerves. Indigestion. Normal ways to think about your friends. Right. She claps, hitting him hard on the back. Gold star. Keep doing that and this'll be over in no time. And then she's grabbed him by the wrist and is dragging him towards the turbo lift, hoping that, if she leads the way, he won't catch a glimpse of the expression on her face. The Titan's ballroom is loath as she is to admit it, nothing short of exquisite. It's nothing like the beige, carpeted event rooms they have to crowd into in the California class. This space is about 3 times the size, with a lacquered floor and a high ceiling splattered with tiny lights that resemble stars. Beckett's always had a bit of a knack for stellar cartography. Growing up staring out the windows of a starship will do that to you. And it doesn't take her longer than a second to notice that the pattern of the lights isn't random. They're arranged in constellations, the exact view of the sky you'd have from San Francisco. There are framed paintings and photographs on the walls, though the lights are dim enough it's hard to make out what any of them are. White tablecloth-covered platforms are floating about the room, strewn with finger sandwiches and replicated caviar, and gawk fresh enough, it's squirming off the plate. A giant model of the Titan in the center of the room makes Beckett grateful Tendy and Rutherford aren't here with them, because she'd probably have to spend most of the evening scraping them off the floor. Normally, Beckett would be the one to lead the way into the room, partly because she likes her air of reckless confidence to precede her, and mostly because she wants to scope out where the bar is. But this time, she hangs dutifully onto Brad's arm, smiling placidly and feeling the cool, recirculated air swish against the satin of her dress as he greets one friend from the Titan, and then another, and then another. And, okay, wow, he's pals with pretty much everybody here. It's a bit of an unfamiliar feeling, Brad receiving the handshakes and the slaps on the back, and guiding her through the thralls of people like he knows exactly where he's going. Beckett served on swanky ships too, of course, but maybe it's the fact she's only here to play a part, or that her demotions from Luna-class vessels weren't quite as voluntary, or even that she's already starting to feel uncomfortable with this tight dress and fake smile as her only armor against the night. She feels out of her element, while Brad, who usually acts like he was custom-engineered in a lab to serve on the Cerritos, seems to be nearly as at home here. It's enough to make Beckett question what could possibly have made him want to leave. Beckett tunes most of it out as she greets a dozen faceless people and shakes a variety of hands, fins, paws, tentacles, and extremities not otherwise specified. She's just starting to plan out how she can sneak away to find a shot of something when she feels something cold against her skin and looks down to find that Brad has shoved a fizzing flute of champagne into her hand. Figured we'd start here. Brad shrugs. Beckett shakes her head, trying to recontextualize her sense of time and space and the past 20-something minutes. Then she snaps her head around to find her answer. While she's been focused on nice-to-meet-yous, Brad somehow escorted her straight from the entrance, through the hordes of partygoers, and in a beeline directly to the bar. Brad grins at her look of appreciation. Cheers! She barely has time to take the glass from his hand before Brad grabs another from the counter, raises it, and downs the entire contents in one gulp. Beckett blinks as he knocks back another. Then she musters up the dreamiest voice in her repertoire. That's my man. Brad regurgitates about half the champagne back into his glass, through his nose. The alcohol does its job, making the noise of the ballroom noticeably less loud and oiling Beckett's socializing gears like, well, old-fashioned oil in old-fashioned gears. After a glass or two, or maybe 3, who's counting, Beckett's dress feels almost not uncomfortable, and she and Brad share a determined look and step back out into the crowd. The first surprise is that it turns out Brad's friends are actually cool. Like, cool, Titan cool. And they seem to think he's cool too, which weirdly doesn't seem to detract from their coolness level. Go figure. They're all record-breaking pilots, and tactical strategists, and Moss researchers, but, like, in a cool way, with stories and battle scars that rival Beckett's. Normally, she'd be way into this they're all kind of her type, and there's one sleek-haired young lieutenant whose antennas suggest she'd definitely be up for some fun, but Beckett finds she just isn't all that interested. Tonight's all about Brad, and maybe she's just that good of a fake girlfriend because she's mostly focused on him, carding her fingers through his hair, mustering up whatever not embarrassing stories she can think to share, doing her fake little laugh every time he tells a joke. Ooh, is that jacket faux Mugato fur? You know, Brad once saved me from a Mugato trap. Fought off 3 Mugatos single-handed and lived to tell the tale. It was so romantic. No way. You guys knew Fletcher, too. You know, that invention that got him promoted was totally Brad's idea. He gave Fletcher credit so the dolt could get his big break. Brad's just so humble. And let me tell you, that's not the only time he's put others' needs before his own. Oh, my Enterprise. Brad's a total voyhead, too. Did you know he beat up Tom Paris? Yeah, that Tom Paris. Said he was defending my honor, I know. So cute. I guess you could say the Delta Quadrant has nothing on our bond. You're scary good at this, Brad mumbles, after Beckett's given particularly compelling account of him delivering Paris 2 black eyes and a broken tailbone. Everyone else has launched into a passionate debate about the Janeway Protocol. Why didn't you go into diplomacy? Just because I'm capable of being civil and boring doesn't mean I want to be, Beckett whispers back, smiling and nodding at a few lieutenants who pass by. Besides, despite the number of ambassadors who seriously deserve it, diplomacy gives you way less opportunity to phaser someone in the dick. Brad barely manages to stifle a snort, which Beckett has to cover up with a dainty sneeze into a napkin. Oh, when he recovers, Brad looks at her in awe. "Who are you?" "Funny," Beckett says, placing her crumpled napkin on the tray of a waiter walking past. "And I thought you'd finally learned my name." The Janeway debate ends somewhat abruptly. Some asshole probably brought Tuvix into the equation. And Beckett snaps back to the party, her smirk shifting into another laugh, and an expression she hopes resembles adoration. It doesn't take long for it to slip. Beckett hears a familiar voice, sees a few heads turn, and realizes, before she's had any time to prepare, the real reason everyone stopped talking. Will Boimler himself, a fresh pip glinting on his collar, is needling his way into the circle. He seems to spot Brad first. The only other purple-haired twig in the room has got to be hard to miss, and gives him a kind of haughty once-over, which Beckett finds wholly unnecessary given they're, physically identical. Brad freezes next to her, like Will's eyes are one of those old transporter beams that slice your arms off if you move too much. Beckett is about to nudge him and tell him to loosen up a bit, that it's only his brother. But then Will's gaze shifts to Beckett, and Beckett suddenly understands what Brad is feeling. It's weird to see him. His eyes are like Brad's, bright, inquisitive, a little shocked, like he can't really believe she's here, but they're not Brad's. His hair is that same shade of purple, maybe a bit darker, his skin just as pasty, his brow furrowed in the same way Brad's always gets. It's strange to think that she's never actually met him. Stranger still, that he has Brad's thoughts and memories that he was actually there, just as much as Brad was. For all the ones they shared, but he isn't Brad. He's somebody different. Somebody Beckett's never spoken to, somebody she's never even touched. Beckett cranes her neck to try to spot the evil glint in his eye, but comes up short. "Will," Brad says. His voice is stilted, like the one he uses when he's speaking to admirals, or diplomats, or anyone with a particularly authoritative mustache. Leave it to Brad to try to suck up to his own clone. Then again, Will's him too, so he's probably into it. Oh boy, this might get weird. "You made it," Will says. It's directed at Brad, but he hasn't taken his eyes off Beckett, and she feels herself squirm under his gaze. His voice is stilted, too sharp, staccato, almost but with a different undertone, one that Beckett can't quite place. She doesn't like it. Brad nods stiffly. She can feel him tensing up beside her, drawing her in closer like a shield. It suddenly occurs to her that this might be the first time Brad has seen Will too, at least since the day of the transporter accident. This might be his first real chance to measure up on a ship that's no longer his, in a uniform with fewer pips, surrounded by people who were his friends, but now serve with his replacement, Beckett, or more. The role she's playing, because it's not like who she actually is makes much of a difference, is probably the only thing that stands between them. Shit. Mariner, Will says, finally turning to acknowledge her, as if he's only just noticed that she's there. It's good to see you. Beckett bites her tongue. He sounds sincere, almost surprisingly so, but she isn't going to let his Brad-like mannerisms sway her. This is a different man, one who left her, and, unlike the Boimler standing next to her, one who never bothered coming back. "Will, was it?" she drawls coldly, holding out a floppy hand. "I don't think we've met." Will's expression flickers for a moment, betraying the cool exterior he's so clearly trying to convey. But he reaches out to shake. Then, just as their fingers are about to meet, Beckett retracts her arm and slings it around Brad's shoulder instead, pulling him close and planting a kiss on the side of his cheek. For good measure, the tips of Brad's ears go bright red, and, despite the tension of the moment, she resists the urge to grin. It's kind of cute how he blushes, even though they both know it's not real. Maybe he's a better actor than she gives him credit for. The move is effective. Will's jaw twitches, and he lets his hand fall back down to his side. He then seems to find this to be the opportune time to introduce his own date, who's just walked up with drinks. Tori, or maybe Talia. Tilius. Is hot Beckett'll give her that. But in a sort of forgettable holodeck extra, Titan background character kind of way. Beckett doesn't catch her name, or her position, or anything other than the fact she doesn't seem all that interested in Will. Which is lucky, because Beckett left her parasite scanning device at home. "So, Brad," Will says, once they've all exchanged their not-so-pleasantries, "how's the Cerritos treating you?" He pronounces Cerritos like you'd pronounce Mugato dung, or Smooth Jazz. Beckett squares her shoulders, bracing herself for Brad's nervous stuttering. But it doesn't come. Instead, he puffs out his chest and speaks with an unusual gusto. It's great, actually. I know from my experience on Galaxy-class ships, it's so easy to get caught up in bureaucracy and meaningless action. But taking the initiative to serve on a Cali-class means I stand out in my field and gain the kinds of hands-on experience that differentiates backseat captains from real leaders. Plus, I have more time to focus on personal development, which means I can excel in other transferable skills. Everyone with the exception of Will nods with appreciation, including Beckett. It's actually a pretty convincing response, made only moderately less so by the mental image of how many times he must have practiced in the sonic shower. And of course, Brad says, suddenly wrapping his arm around Beckett's waist. Even if I didn't have all that, it'd be worth it. Just for Beckett. It's perfectly normal for your stomach to flutter when anyone puts their arm around you like they never want to let you go. So Beckett definitely doesn't need to worry any more about it. It's even more normal to not want them to let you go, because Beckett may be a strong, independent badass, but she also gets a little touch-starved sometimes, which is fine and normal, and actually kind of edgy if you think about it. She'd probably feel the exact same way if this was Tendi or Rutherford, except that she can't imagine either of them ever saying her name quite the way Brad just said it, and also, both of them are somewhat normal enough that she'd probably never be in this situation with them anyway. What's really more important is how Brad is suddenly managing to be so smooth, despite the fact he's lying through his teeth. Normal Brad would be jittery and sweating bullets right now, but he says it so naturally that, if she didn't know better, she'd almost be convinced herself. It's impressive in a way that makes you wonder what other secrets he's got locked up in that stupid purple head of his. Several people awe, reverently, and Beckett does her best to shift her attention away from the strange pounding in her chest, again, probably just nerves, and onto the act of beaming up at him. Will grips his champagne glass a little tighter. Unfortunately for him, this seems to be what opens the floodgates. To Brad's friends, no. Will's friends, no. Boimler's friends on the Titan. Will's promotion is apparently old news, while Brad's escapades, aided by some of Beckett's more indulgent embellishments, are much more compelling. The questions start spilling in, and Brad, who seems content in having said his piece, takes a step back and lets Beckett take charge. Which is great, because it really gives her a chance to lay it on thick. "If you think that's sweet," she says wistfully, careful to angle her face to the ceiling so the false stars reflect in her eyes. "You should hear about our first date on Starbase 25. Brad took me on this crazy adventure, and we had our first kiss in the same bar Kirk and Spock did." She turns to meet Will's eyes and offers him her most cloying smile. "It was so kind of you to give us your invite, Will. Such a shame you couldn't be there." Several people sigh contentedly, including a Vulcan who Beckett is pretty sure has been hitting the chocolate fountain a little too hard. Will, caught in the tractor beam of Beckett's gaze, gives what looks like a very pained nod. Leave it to a Boimler to get this jealous about missing Starfleet's gaudiest bigwig suck-up fest. And you've all heard about his heroics with the Archimedes, of course, but there was also that time he boarded a Borg ship and totally saved the Cerritos. His mission was just to get a good to get in and out. But did you know he risked assimilation to rescue like 6 Borg babies, rather than leave them to grow up in the collective? A grumpy-looking Tellarite quirks an eyebrow. I hadn't heard the Cerritos had an encounter with the Borg. Oh, Beckett says, waving a hand. You wouldn't have. It's totally classified. She takes a long sip of her drink. Anyway, that's how I knew he was going to be an incredible father. Brad's hand falls from her waist as he chokes violently on his drink. But several officers in the circle nod earnestly, which is kind of concerning. You don't. Will is no longer meeting Beckett's eyes, but his date is looking at them with a strange expression on her face. Beckett sees her eyes flit to Brad's collar, and she feels herself stiffen. Besides, it isn't like Lieutenant What's-Her-Name is the only one. People have been doing it all night looking to Brad's neck to see which Boimler he is, checking whether it's their Starfleet-sanctioned duty to respect him. Beckett knows the feeling. She's been demoted enough times that old friends' eyes always dart to her pips before they register her face, as if to ask, "Before, how are you? Haven't you gotten your life together yet?" And Beckett's an ensign by choice. She can't imagine how Brad must feel, all dorky and rank-obsessed and demoted via freak transporter accident. As much as Beckett can relate, she's never had to stand face-to-face with an exact duplicate of herself, identical to the atom, only shittier and more successful. Okay, there was her weird holodeck persona who managed to take her down in her own Vindicta program, but Brad has told her that doesn't count. Repeatedly. Will's date opens her mouth to speak, and it's almost instinctual, partly because it might piss Will off a little further, but mostly because she just wants to give Brad the reassurance. Beckett finds his hand and interlaces her fingers with his. It seems to be well received. Brad squeezes back and lets a thumb grace over her knuckles, which is fine. Comfortable. Certainly better than her backup option, which was to replicate matching turtlenecks that said, "My eyes are up here." Of course, Beckett says, before Will's date can say anything. Brad was offered several promotions for his heroics, but he didn't take them. I'm still an ensign, and I guess he just cared more about me than superficial rank climbing. Will's date closes her mouth with a huff. Will, meanwhile, is still clutching tightly at his champagne, jaw clenched as he scowls at the glittering floor. Beckett has to give Brad credit. This plan is working. Much better than she'd thought it would, given Will has 2 extra pips on his collar, and a date he's presumably more interested in than her. Maybe transporter clones are just, really prone to jealousy. Or maybe Will has a screw loose from being forced to listen to so many of Riker's saxophone rehearsals. Either way, Beckett's almost sort of enjoying herself. Sure, it's stupidly loud, and her dress is uncomfortable, and Brad's hand is weirdly sweaty. But there's something deeply satisfying about the way Will is almost quivering with rage. Maybe it's the fact she's finally getting a chance to express everything she never got to, or that it seems to be affecting him so damn much. Or even just that she's finally managing to pull off something nice for Brad instead of fucking everything up. Whatever it is, it's cathartic. Somehow like therapy, except with more liquor and fewer fruit metaphors and the same amount of lying, which is pretty much Beckett's sweet spot. Bjorn. And you said you guys outsmarted an Orion syndicate? A tiny Denobulan crewman asks expectantly. Oh yeah, Beckett says, nudging Brad with her elbow. You want to take this one, babe? I'm good, he says weakly. Okay, Beckett says, gesturing with her free hand to set the scene. So Brad and I were on a top-secret Cation archaeology mission, and a cool Vash-type one. Not a stuffy Picard one when Orion pirates somehow saw through my cunning yet culturally appropriate disguise. Our orders were to get the artifact to safety under any circumstances, but Brad sacrificed the artifact and his own career to help get me to safety. She looks around the group before finally settling her gaze on Will. I guess some things, integrity, loyalty, are just worth more than a promotion. She nudges Brad. Right, babe. I don't think I was even there for that one. Brad hisses through clenched teeth. Beckett elbows him in the rib. Shut up. There's another round of oohs and ahs from the circle. The Denobulan looks like she's considering asking for Brad's autograph. Will, meanwhile, is now a color Beckett's only seen in holonovels. His glass of champagne full, flat, And now Forgotten is still in his hand, which is now shaking with envy or anger? Humiliation? To be honest, Beckett isn't really sure. Brad's hand, though, is warm, albeit kind of sticky, and he squeezes again, which she interprets to mean thank you. Or you're amazing, or please stop calling me babe, or I'll throw up. Hey, she's been there. But of course, Beckett says graciously, turning towards Will and drawing herself in a little closer to Brad. Today is your day, Will. What have you been up to? I wouldn't know, because you never stayed in touch. For whatever reason, and Beckett can't pretend to know the inner workings of this asshole's mind, this is what does it. Without warning, Will's glass shatters, sending shards of jagged crystal skidding across the floor and drenching the front of Beckett's dress in cold champagne. A dozen people jump backwards. A Kazinti lieutenant hisses and sprints away, and Beckett yelps as the freezing liquid fizzes against her skin. Before she can do anything else, Brad's hand has dropped from hers and he's turned towards her, his fingers skirting her bare arms as he checks for damage. Are you okay? I'm fine, Beckett says breathlessly, running her hands down her stomach to swipe off some of the excess liquid. Just wet. Several people hand her cocktail napkins. A few others kneel down to pick the larger pieces of glass up off the floor. Brad gives her one last look, and then, apparently satisfied, swivels on his heels to face Will. What the fuck, Lieutenant? Will is standing, frozen in place, still gripping the broken stem of the champagne flute in his hand. He's staring at both of them, wide-eyed and startled, looking more like Brad than he has all night. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean... It's fine, Beckett says flatly. Seriously. There's another small splattering of liquid as she wrings out the bottom of her dress. You're sorry? Brad says, taking a step towards Will. Is that it? Is that all you have to say? After... Beckett puts a hand on his shoulder. Seriously, she says. I'm just gonna go change. Brad looks back to her, his posture softening under her touch. Are you sure? Yeah, Beckett says, wiping one last strand of hair off on a cocktail napkin, and then placing the entire sopping mound on another passing waiter's tray. About time I got out of this thing anyway. Brad's gaze lingers on her for a moment, his eyes darting from her face, down her gown, and then to Will. It's as if he's torn between wanting to help her and wanting to force-feed his clone an antimatter slushy. Will's date, who seems to have missed the brunt of the deluge, is standing off to the side, looking equally pissed. Do you want me to come? Nah, Beckett says. I can handle myself. And giving his shoulder one final squeeze, she drops her hand and turns to leave. Then she stops, spins back around and winks. Don't worry, you can totally undress me later, babe. And grinning devilishly at the look on Brad's face, Beckett turns and disappears into the crowd. The clothing replicator's not too hard to find. Beckett knows her way around a starship, even a big, pretentious, shiny one like the Titan. She inputs her measurements and scrolls through the formal wear options, shivering a little from the champagne dripping down her front, and ignoring the goosebumps still splattered across her arms from where Brad's fingers had brushed her, to check she was okay. Most of the options are pretty boring. A ball gown here, a jumpsuit there. Someone's input a joke Betazoid marriage outfit, which prints out a square meter of warm air. And then, just as she's about to give up, she finds it. This time it's actually something special. Something Beckett. A suit, sleek and black and tapered at the ankles. She makes a few quick customizations, and then, briefly glancing both ways down the dark hallway, slips out of her sticky dress right there in the replicator room, pulling on the soft slacks and crisp shirt as soon as they appear, still warm from the replication process. Beckett feels better almost instantly, not just because she no longer reeks of champagne well. Okay, maybe she still reeks a little of champagne, but also because this look just fits. Beckett may not be playing herself tonight, or at least her real self, but she still is herself, to whoever's fortune or misfortune that may be. Sure, she's pretending to love Brad, pretending to be someone with a little less to hide, but one thing remains consistent across all versions of herself. Beckett Marinler looks damn good in a tux. She turns to the window and takes in her reflection, straightening her sleeves against the backdrop of the galaxy outside. The buttons on her blazer delta-shaped, to match Brad's cufflinks, glitter in the starlight as she pulls her still-dripping hair into a ponytail, a little neater than the one she usually wears. Normally, Beckett would want to stay here longer, to relish in the cool silence of an uninhabited room, to take in the view outside, to spend some precious time alone, away from the chaos and the tumult of the party. But tonight, there's something itching inside of her. Maybe it's the buzz from the alcohol, or the thrill of pranking Will, or even just the novelty of getting to pretend to be a different version of herself. But Beckett doesn't need more than a moment here, because what she really wants, in her swishing pants and starch-white shirt, is to be back out there, laughing, arm in arm with Brad. Beckett barely notices heads turning as she makes her way back out into the ballroom. Her gaze is zeroed in on Will and Brad, who are still standing arguing, by the looks of it, in the same spot she'd left them. From this distance, it's easier to make out the differences between them. Will stands a little taller, jutting his chin out more in a way that's not quite confident, but almost prideful. He fills out the dress scant a bit more, like he's been working out and his hair is sleeker, no longer the soft purple mess that Beckett likes to run her hand through. The look doesn't really fit him. Will blends in, looking a little more like every other faceless Titan officer. Every lieutenant who isn't good for much more than riling up. Brad, with his anxious slump and dainty hips, just pulls the whole thing off better. There's something to him that Will never have. Brad is the first to see her, then Will, and Beckett has to bite her lip to keep from grinning as both of their jaws slacken. She knows she looks great, but it's nice to have some validation. Even if that validation is coming from a friend, and a weird ex-friend current enemy clone thing who outranks you. This seems to be the final straw for Will's date, who storms away from him and out of Beckett's peripheral vision in a huff. Beckett can't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She and Brad may be upstaging Will, but there's no real reason for him to so upset that he's ignoring his own date. Maybe she can take some solace in the fact she can do way better. Beckett doesn't bother worrying about it too much. The suit is much more comfortable, light and soft and fitted to her curves with just enough flow for her to move. The false stars twinkle above, casting shadows in the dark windows of the model ship, suspend from the ceiling, and the music swirls around her, strumming to the beat of the warp core below her feet. Beckett feels more in her element now, the champagne dancing in her stomach, along with that itch, that tug deep in her gut, the urge to make tonight into something more. She saunters up to Brad and Will, who are still both standing there, motionless, like a holodeck program somebody's paused mid-conversation. Smiling sweetly, and without so much as a sideways glance at Will, she holds an arm out to Brad. "May I have this dance?" Brad says. "Try again." Yes. Beckett can't really blame him. She's sure Brad can't dance, and even if he could, the idea of being in the spotlight, let alone letting loose in front of a couple hundred people he's trying to impress, can't be his idea of a good time. But Beckett's feeling flirty, and there's pretty much no one else in the galaxy she'd be willing to fake simp over so convincingly, so Brad really kind of owes her this. She takes his hand and guides him to the dance floor, careful to angle them to be directly in Will's line of sight. Will is still watching them, while very unsuccessfully pretending not to watch, which just makes the whole thing more delicious. At this point, Beckett could almost say that she's more into pissing Will off than Brad is. He seems less focused on his clone, and more on her, positioning his arms just right, looking anywhere but her eyes, instead flitting his gaze to the crook of her ear, the curve of her shoulder, the bounce of her almost dry hair. Beckett knows it's just an act, but the guy's good enough so that, with all the flurry of the drinks and the music, she can almost feel her heart skip several beats. She shifts her own gaze from a bitter Will to the Brad right in front of her. "So, it seems to be good timing." The black-shirted band in the corner. Beckett's been trying all night to figure out if they're holograms or not, but figures it'd be rude to try to wave a hand through them. Starts playing a slower, more syrupy tune, and she and Brad fall into step. It turns out Brad is a surprisingly adept dancer. Not that she thought he wouldn't be. Except, well, okay, She definitely thought he wouldn't be. You wouldn't imagine someone so lanky and accident-prone could be so swift on their feet, but he's skilled enough she almost doesn't have to lead. Which means she doesn't have to be so focused on counting her steps, her childhood holo dancing instructor's criticisms ringing in her head, and she can settle into the movement a little, leaning into his grasp and swaying to the music, feeling the warmth of his shoulder under her palm. It's not bad, but it's different. Unexpected. A lot of things with Brad are lessons, Brad says. He's apparently read her mind. I had dancing lessons as a kid. Beckett quirks an eyebrow. They paid off. Brad MHMs as they spin, his fingers settling against her waist and sending sparks of electricity cascading down her spine. Sure did. I was Modesto's Grape Festival king 2 years running. It takes Beckett a moment to swallow this momentously humiliating piece of information, and another moment to choke down her laugh, a real one this time. You were not. I was, Brad says defensively. I had a crown and everything. Beckett tilts her head. And a sash. Brad leans her into a dip so that she gets a view of his face, framed by the shimmering lights and shining metal of the ceiling. Oh yeah. Beckett bites her tongue. Normally she'd feel the urge to tease him, or punch him, or give him some version of the very aptly named Purple Nurple, but instead, as she looks at him, as they move to the music, she's filled with an overwhelming rush of affection for the dork. For a brief moment, she glances back to where Will had been watching them, but she can no longer find him in the crowd, and then the thought of him is gone as they swing upward again, Brad still leading, Beckett still following, her suit shifting effortlessly as they move. You have got to be kidding me, dude. I'm serious, Brad says. My mom will show you the whole photo album. Damn, Beckett grins. First date and you're already inviting me to meet your parents. You really know how to treat a girl. Brad's face flushes, just like she'd been hoping for, and the tips of his ears go red, but to his credit, he doesn't trip over his own feet. Well, he says, it's only fair. I've already met yours. Bet you wish you hadn't. Brad lets out a half-stifled snort, evidently torn between wanting to laugh and being too much of a suck-up to imply anything bad about a captain. The idiot. Just don't tell me I have to ask them for your hand. The only one you have to ask is me, Beckett says coolly. It's only banter, not like it really means anything. But Beckett's cheeks feel warm, and her breath feels short, and the air between them is carbonated like champagne. They turn, and she spins smoothly under Brad's outstretched arm. And also fight off all my rival suitors. Brad makes a face as he guides her back in. Didn't you date a Nausicaan once? She was a total lightweight. Beckett shrugs. Still, I don't suppose it was an Anbo Jutsu competition? Not tying, actually, Brad says. The judges said I had very nimble fingers. Beckett almost chokes, missing several steps and careening forwards into him. Brad's fingers alleged nimbleness, notwithstanding clench against her waist to catch her, and several fireflies ignite inside Beckett's stomach. She looks up to make sure her laughter hasn't hurt his feelings, but Brad's grinning stupidly back at her as they straighten up and find their footing again. When they have, to the firefly's delight, his fingers don't slacken on her waist. Be real with me, Beckett says. Did this happen in the 18th fucking century? Are you a time traveler? Brad steals his gaze as he guides her back into step, several other couples glancing at them with annoyance. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to disclose that information. Oh, I'm sorry, Beckett says. I would have thought you had diplomatic immunity, seeing as you're Modesto Grape royalty and all. Brad laughs a real, genuine, heart-fluttering laugh, and they settle back into a steady rhythm, the music rising and falling around them, the party a blur of stars and whirling colors. The song is perfect for the pace, Brad's hands soft and warm against her skin, and Beckett lets the moment bloom inside of her. It's actually a really important skill, Brad says eventually. Knot tying, I mean. Farmers go wild for it, obviously. But did you know a replicator can't tie a real knot? It can produce 2 pieces of rope and it can materialize them together in a kind of pseudo-knot. But it can't create anything that actually holds. They spin again, and he pauses as the music swells. It drives a lot of people crazy. Brad continues, pulse beating steady through his palm that we can't just conjure them up from a computer, because to actually link two separate pieces, you need something greater than just the sum of its parts. A real knot has to have intentionality and understanding and some level of love, as stupid as that sounds, or it just falls apart at the first pull. There's no way to simulate it, but that's what makes the practice worthwhile. I think it's special because it can't be faked, you know? Beckett nods, a million answers on the tip of her tongue, a million more electric beneath her fingertips. Obviously, I know replicators can't tie knots, she says. I chose the last name Marinler. Brad considers this. That kind of explains a lot, actually. She elbows him. No, it doesn't. Shut up! The music, without Beckett realizing, has reached its crescendo, and the notes are starting to slow again, each one like a plink of water greeting Earth from an ever-shrinking cloud. They shift to the music, Brad's fingers still firm against her waist, the scent of his hair wafting as they move. What? Beckett says. Brad's still looking at her, has been this whole time, in a way that makes her insides ache. Nothing, says Brad. The music pulls them apart and back together, clasped hands meeting at their chests. His skin shines under the starlight, and she can almost taste his champagne-sticky breath. Beckett's expression doesn't waver, and, eventually, Brad sighs as they twist again. Two bodies joined as one. I was just thinking that it's kind of nice to be alone with you. He pauses for a beat. You know, without everyone else. And having to do all this, it's just been more overwhelming than I'd been expecting. The fireflies in Beckett's gut have given up their buzzing and are now throwing some kind of bioluminescent insect rave. You can say that again. Which part? He's too stupid. It's what makes him so endearing. He can't read between the lines. Can't just let her get away with it. Could never let her to live not having said it. Maybe it's on purpose. Brad extends an arm and Beckett glides under it too easily. That's the worst part, how effortless it is. How much she wants to. They spin one last time, the momentum propelling them together. And Beckett can't help it, can't hold it back. The words roll off her tongue like honey. It's kind of nice to be alone with you. The dubiously real band hits the final few notes of the song, and they take their last steps, and then part. Brad is beaming, and Beckett can feel it on her own face too, along with a flush from the heat and the fluidity with which they'd fit together. The dancers disperse as the band transitions to a jauntier melody, and Beckett turns, then has a start as she catches sight of another tuft of purple hair somewhere in the crowd. She lets her hand fall out of Brad's. She'd been so caught up in the moment. Beckett had almost forgotten they were doing this for Will. They decide to hit the hors d'oeuvres table next, the tension slipping away as they get caught up in the throngs of other partygoers. Just as they're making their way back, Beckett stuffing a finger sandwich in her mouth as gracefully as she can, she catches Riker's voice calling them over. He's standing with Troy, Will, and a few others who Beckett had met earlier, but can't for the life of her remember the names of... Hey, not her fault there's free champagne. Riker is red-faced and jovial, clearly a bit smashed, and he slaps both Beckett and Brad a little too heartily on the back as they join the circle. Nemes, Marinler, he roars. Good to see you in one piece, as usual. Right back at ya. Beckett grins. Flirt with any holograms lately? Only my beautiful wife, Riker says chastely, while Troy rolls her eyes. But then, he leans in, making gleeful eye contact with the both of them. It sounds like you two would know all about that, eh? Brad gulps, audibly, and something stirs inside Beckett, too. A twist of worry she doesn't have the fingers to untangle. Can't say I wasn't surprised, of course, Riker says, oblivious to Brad's rapidly purpling face. Back when he was one of mine, Will well, Brad well, Lieutenant no, Ensign, Mr. Boimler, Troy supplies. Mr. Boimler, Riker says, told me all about your little, mentorship. Even let me listen to a few of those voicemails of yours. Can't say I had much faith in reconciliation after that. He chuckles at Brad knowingly and thumps a hand down on his shoulder, making Brad's knees buckle. Still, looks like I managed to get through to one of the Boimlers after all, eh? Brad releases a small, strangled, choking sound, which he quickly maneuvers into a cough. Will, who had already been glowering at them, scowls even harder. And, out of the corner of her eye, Beckett catches Troy flit her gaze almost imperceptibly between the two of them, and then take a hurried sip of her drink. But Beckett doesn't have time to read into any of that, because Riker finally releases Brad and reaches around him to slap her on the back again, almost sending her finger sandwich right back up. "Oh, and you," he says, giving Beckett a sly grin and sloshing a bit of his drink onto Brad's shirt. "I know your usual type. Remember when you dated that cowardly Nausicaan?" Beckett dabs Brad's chest with a napkin. "I try not to." "Well, look at you now," Riker says, raising his glass. "Two of my favorite ensigns/protégés. He turns to the other officers in the circle. "If you'll forgive me, but really, I never thought I'd see the day." Brad makes another sound that can only be compared to the shrill gurgle of a dying Bajoran slime worm. Beckett has to say it, the dude's thing for praise is really starting to get out of hand. She barely has it in her to notice, though, because she's busy glancing again from Riker to Troy to Will, then to Troy again, the small tangle of concern quickly spiraling into a full-blown panic. It would have been too much for tonight to go smoothly. It would have been too simple for them to end on a good note, to piss off Will and dance and leave with nobody the wiser. Beckett would have been too lucky, and if there's one thing she's learned, in years of red alerts and abandonment and away missions gone awry, it's that luck will never come so easily, because for all her planning and log studying and weirdly sensual meetings with Brad's ex, Beckett may have failed to consider the two biggest obstacles to this scheme's success, both of whom are now standing right in front of her. "Not that I doubted Mr. Bradward here," Riker's saying. "Oh no, I just wasn't sure you'd ever have the gall to admit it. I'm impressed, frankly. Beckett, you've actually softened up a bit. He must have done a real number on you." Beckett considers running, turning on her heels and sprinting away, like she's done countless times, again and again since she was a kid. But if there's another thing Beckett's learned, it's that running never works. The problem always catches up, and Brad's body is solid next to her, the weight of it all hanging in the air. Beckett's reminded how much tonight means to him, how much of it is about proving himself to Will, to Riker, how much of it is about proving to himself that he made the right choice coming home. Her feet stay rooted to the spot. Still, it must be quite the story. Her next thought is to elbow Brad, trying to communicate some subtle signal to the tune of, "Any ideas?" Or, "Please tell me you didn't forget about my old friend in the literal telepath." But Brad, apparently submerged in his own cocktail of neuroses, can't seem to meet her eyes. Beckett tries to gulp down another sip of champagne without meeting anyone else's eyes. But this proves difficult, given they all seem to be on her. "And you've always been quite the storyteller," Riker says. Beckett gulps, the impending question looming over like a shadow. "So, Becky, I have to know, what finally made you fall for him? It's as if the entire room goes quiet, like someone opens an airlock door and all the laughter and conversation is flushed out into space, while some asshole upstairs shuts off every light except the one above her head." She has to say something true. Beckett knows that. That's the difference. Something about Brad that's just real enough that it can wiggle its way past Riker's discernment and Troy's empathic lie detectors. But it also has to be something that some hypothetical, weird, vaguely humanoid person could conceivably find attractive. Talk about putting the moron in oxymoron. More than that, Beckett just has to say something. She squeezes her eyes shut, trying to think back to her research, to whatever Barb had said in between gushing about her parasite and repeatedly annihilating Beckett at spring ball. But it had been so much easier earlier, before she'd been dizzy from dancing, before the strings of light had blurred together into new and thrilling constellations, when she'd only been lying to strangers and Will. Low stakes, and without a betazoid standing a stone's toss away. Now, Beckett's thoughts are out of focus, muddled by champagne and worry, and the red alert still blaring in her brain, begging her to ask Riker what exactly he'd gotten through to Brad about. "Well?" Beckett says. She tries to swallow, but it's as if she's eating sand. Beside her, Brad looks more panicked than he has all night, red to the ears and bracing himself like the floor's about to fall out from under them, like he's already expecting her to fail. Without giving herself any time to think about it, Beckett reaches down and finds his hand again, intertwining his fingers with hers. It's mostly because she's stalling for time, but also because he seems to really need it. And maybe a little bit because she needs it too. Well, she says again, taking a breath and then several gulps of her champagne. He's funny? Nobody speaks. Brad's heartbeat is thrumming through his palm, and the pit in Beckett's stomach deepens. And, she bites her lip. What had Barb said? His hair is, really soft. She turns her face up to the circle, desperate for an out, but it doesn't come. Everyone is still watching in expectant silence, and Beckett suddenly feels stupid. Stupid for agreeing to this ridiculous plan. Stupid for trading her dignity for a smile and a couple of holodeck slots. Stupid for setting herself up to fail, like she always does, because this is an impossible plan and an impossible promise, and she can never come through when it counts. Brad has barely stirred next to her, his breathing shallow against the evening's heat, but he somehow seems to find the wherewithal to skim a thumb over her knuckles again. The sensation sets her skin alight. Something true. Oh, and I guess I don't find him quite as obnoxious as everybody else in Starfleet, she says, raising her glass at the crowd, present company included. Several people laugh apparently under the assumption she was joking, and Brad exhales an iota deeper. Beckett glances at Troy, trying to suppress any of the thoughts threatening to jump into the frame of her attention, but Troy watches back with an unreadable expression on her face. Kind of unfair it doesn't work the other way around. And then, Beckett says, willing the liquor in her system to invent the words for her, he's kind of smart. She pauses, taking another sip and mulling the liquid on her tongue. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's fucking stupid. The guy couldn't catch a hint if it, danced right in front of him. She swallows, breathes. But he's smart too, more than he realizes. It's like, sometimes I don't even have to tell him what to do because he already knows. Or his idea is better. Which, I guess someone could conceivably find not repulsive. Riker nods enthusiastically, in a way that's eerily reminiscent of the Riker bobbleheads they offer in the Enterprise gift shop, but which doesn't suggest he or Troy has caught on to the deception. Will is wearing an expression that suggests he's convinced he'll turn into stone if her looks Beckett in the eyes. But still no one speaks, and Beckett gets the sense she's going to have to come up with more. And, she says, he's kind of passionate. Her cheeks flush, the words sticking on her tongue. And I don't mean with people. Well, not that he's not, because obviously we're well. Beckett shakes her head. Something true. I just mean that he cares so deeply for the things he likes. You know. She raises her drink halfway to her mouth again, then smiles and lowers it again before it hits her lips. Like, you should see him with his dorky-ass decorative plate collection, or practicing his stupid little captain speeches when he thinks you're not listening in the vents. Brad stiffens a little, and Beckett has a strange feeling they're going to have to talk about that one later. Or even his obsession with every fucking minutia of protocol. She continues, trying to say it all as quickly as she can, and ignoring the clammy warmth of his palm against her hand. Like, yeah, it's lame. Oh my god, so fucking lame. But sometimes it's kind of nice he cares so much, you know? Not everyone does. And sometimes it reminds you what Starfleet's meant to be. She takes another sip, fingers just barely shaking against the glass's crystal stem. It's almost embarrassing, saying it out loud, especially to people who are alive and presumably sentient. But it would be more embarrassing for this entire con to fall apart, for Beckett to mess up and make a fool out of the both of them. to ruin Brad's chances at success like she's done so many times before, for reasons she can never put her finger on. And it almost seems to be working. Troy hasn't called her out on a lie, at least, and Will, to his credit, is clenching the fist not currently holding a fresh flute of champagne. Besides, maybe it's the way the lights are dancing across the tabletops, or the bursts of tiny bubbles on her lips, but it almost feels kind of exhilarating to say it, too. Oh, and I guess, Beckett continues, the words flowing a little easier now, like she no longer has to make a real effort not to lie. It's like we kind of balance each other out, or we push each other to be better, even when he's pushing all my fucking buttons. Like he helped me steal a starship, even though he's all horny for rules and shit, just because I needed him. Or the other day, at this stupid recruitment booth, he held me back from tearing some assholes a new one so I wouldn't get demoted, and then he went off instead. It was so stupid, and cute, and unexpected. He never stopped surprising me. Brad squirms next to her, which is actually more reassuring than anything has been all night. Hell, if Beckett had known saying nice things about him would get him all hot and bothered like this, she might have started doing it years ago. Riker, meanwhile, is listening in rapt attention, as if Beckett's gushing is the climactic monologue on the galaxy's hottest hollow soap opera. Everybody else seems entranced too, with the exception of Will, who appears to be in a heated staring match with the floor, and Troy, who's contemplating her chocolate martini. Sight? The fireflies in Beckett's stomach have woken up again, greeting the dawn inside her like a fireworks display. Her skin is pulsing with the adrenaline of defending the act, of holding Brad's hand, of looking every person in the eyes. It's almost simpler, saying things that actually happened, instead of twisting the facts just to make sure they land the way they should, like she's finally taking off the stifling mask and breathing as herself again, as stupid as that sounds while she's still standing front and center on the stage. And then there was this time our shuttle crashed, Beckett says, a little too quickly now, and I thought he was being such an idiot. I mean, he fucking phasered me. I still have the scar to prove it. It was incredible. She almost laughs. But it turned out I'd underestimated him again, and he had this whole stupid, gutsy plan to save us. And it worked, even though all I'd fucking done was doubt him. Beckett takes another gulp of her champagne, skin alight with electricity. But it wasn't even that. We were stranded, right? On this shitty desert planet. I mean, worse than Vulcan without food or deodorant or anything. We probably almost killed each other a dozen times. And I was still mad at him he'd only just come back from the Titan, and I was so fucking mad he'd left. But I just remember thinking that even though he was all sweaty and angry and disgusting, and even though it sucked that maybe it wasn't all that bad, because I'd rather be marooned for eternity with him than anybody else. Beckett is vaguely aware of dozens of pairs of eyes on her, but she can hardly see them now. She can only focus on the Brad's shoulder stiff against her side, on the smell of his hair gel wafting over the evening's heat and sweat. Did he ever tell you how I sabotaged his relationship with Barb? Like, full-on stalked and pantsed her in a cargo bay. Because the idea of someone liking him drove me so crazy. I thought she had to be a monster. Beckett feels flushed now, but the words keep spilling out, everything around her dulled and dimmer in their presence. Or when he left for the Titan. She nods up at the steel walls around them. I could have fucking strangled him, even though he deserved that dumb promotion, because he was going without me. Because what the hell was I supposed to do without him? The liquor is swimming in her head now, her cheeks hurting from the smile she can barely tell is on her face. Beckett can feel that same thrill, that itch, that tugging in her chest, the drive to do something real, though she's lost track of what. It's like her mouth is speaking for her, like she's a dam they've opened up to let the river through, like there's nobody there except for him. Or Tolgana the Four. Beckett laughs more like an exhale than anything, 1,000 breaths all coming out at once. I pulled so many fucking strings to get put on that stupid mission with him. We barely knew each other yet. I just wanted to annoy him, because he was just so dorky, and adorable, and sincere. I didn't want to be away from him even for a second. Even when we lost the shuttle and all our supplies and everything went wrong, because I think she wets her lip, the air thick with sticky tension, her heart wrapped up between their hands. I don't think there was any one thing that made me like him. I think maybe I just always have. Beckett finally stops to breathe. The river dries, her lungs heaving to catch up, and all the blood that's been pooling in her cheeks finds its way back into her brain. Standing there, palms slick with Brad's cold sweat, she realizes that someone must have opened that imaginary airlock door again, because there's a silence fast enough to drown out everything except the heartbeat pulsing in the back of Beckett's throat. Beckett's just opening her mouth to speak, finding it full of sand again, when Troy, very tenderly, turns and breaks the silence in her place. "Will, dear." It happens in slow motion. Will doesn't answer, doesn't even raise his head. Instead, slowly, he opens his clenched fist, and for the second time tonight, his glass of champagne slices through the air and shatters hard against the glittering black floor. There are distant yelps and curses as feet rise and land again, and Will turns hard on his heels and storms out of the room. Beckett glances up. Riker, whose gaze is flitting between Beckett, Brad, and the retreating Will, like they're the championship match at Space Wimbledon, opens his mouth to say something, but Troy downs the last of her martini in one intimidating gulp, grabs him by the forearm, and drags him out of view. The remaining onlookers scatter to look for towels, or band-aids, or maybe sections of the party with few falling breakables, which leaves Beckett and Brad, hand in sweaty hand, alone together once again. "You... damn," Beckett says, turning to him with a grin. "Clone, you really inherited your penchant from dramatics. I mean, I know we were trying to piss him off, but I had no idea he was so insecure." But her smile falls as she catches sight of the look on Brad's face. He's staring at her, chalk white, eyes wide, his own glass clenched tightly in his fist. The entire evening's worth of champagne seems to hit Beckett at once, and she blinks, taking a step back. "Sorry," she says quickly. Was that too far? I was just, trying to sell it," and her voice falters as she looks at him. After all this time, all the running and arguing and almost dying, Beckett had thought she knew how to read him, thought she'd memorized every one of his expressions, all the way from Bold and Captain Freeman Day, down to Haughty and Bad Gas. But now, as he stands there, his fingers slack against her grip, the look on Brad's face is one Beckett doesn't recognize. Brad says, shoulders straightening and eyes flitting to anywhere but her. No, listen, I'd better go check on him, okay?" So, and without another word, Brad slips his hand out of Beckett's grasp and follows after Will, leaving Beckett standing there, red-faced, alone. Beckett spends about 2 minutes thinking about it, and also trying to mop up the spilled champagne with several dozen napkins. Do starships even have a cleaning crew? Before she makes the inevitable decision to go after him. It isn't easy. Her head, no longer pumping with adrenaline, is now churning with thoughts and worse, feelings instead, which makes it difficult to weave through the throngs of people and wind down hallway after hallway without doubling back on herself a few times. She ends up in a supply closet once, and the rubber ducky room twice before she finally finds them. A pair of stilted whispers, slinking out from a darkened offshoot corridor. "Just listen. Didn't mean... some kind of moron if you think." Beckett crouches down and cranes her neck around the corner, careful to keep her back pressed against the wall. Her breathlessness from running, worrying she isn't sure is audible, and she tries to stifle it, taking in long lungfuls of the cool, filtered air and exhaling with her eyes closed to the night. She hadn't meant it. Obviously, Brad knows she hadn't meant it, knows she was trapped by Troy and Riker. Had to say anything she could to keep Will from finding out. Ew. It doesn't matter that Beckett was trying to be honest. She had failed was all. The champagne and prank had gotten in the way, and she'd lost track of things. Troy hadn't seen Beckett in several years, and simply couldn't get a read on her. Hadn't been able to tell she hadn't meant it, and even if Beckett had meant it, She hadn't meant to mean it, which is definitely kind of the same thing. The voices slip out again. The words carried through the air as the climate control fans switch on. They're barely louder than Beckett's own internal monologue, muffled further by the hum of the lights and the deep, grounding thrum of the warp core underneath her feet. Tired of you always? Show me up! Pretending I don't know. The heat from her sprint has started to dissipate, and Beckett shivers for the first time in the cold, the champagne-spritzed cuffs of her pant legs clinging to her ankles. Everything except her breath seems to have caught up with her now, the ache in her chest, the terror dancing in her stomach, all the words she'd said tonight and didn't say. Brad's and Will's voices, and it's getting easier to distinguish them, now are sharp and resonant. Beckett still can't see them through the shadows, but she can see them in her head. Brad, with those wide eyes and his terrified expression. Will, angry, his hand full of shattered glass. She wants to reach forward through her thoughts and touch them, tell Brad it hadn't meant a thing. But after tonight, Beckett isn't sure how much lying is left in her. Oh, the way things. Not like she actually. A coward if you make the same mistake that I... Beckett pushes it all down as she creeps forward, trying to make out a coherent sentence above the din of the ship and the sounds of the distant party wafting through the vents. An hour ago, it had all felt kind of exciting. The novelty of it, the words coming out like music, the potential clinging like static to her skin, the unfamiliar engine pounding like metal heart beneath her feet. Beckett had liked the freedom of it. The lying, the dancing, the electricity, the contact of skin on skin on skin. Now, in the dark, the noise only feels ominous. Hair standing on end before the lightning strikes. The climate system's power off, and Brad's voice finally sounds clear. A fucking prank. She had to study for it, Will. It takes a moment for the words to hit her, but then Beckett isn't thinking. Not for the first time tonight. Her mouth betrays her, and, forgetting her plan and pride, and several years of Starfleet training, Beckett leaps to her feet and springs from the shelter of the shadows. You're telling him? Both Boimlers snap their heads toward her so fast it makes her dizzy. Brad stiffens, going pale as a ghost. But Will just eyes her bitterly. For a moment the silence drowns out all else. Then Brad speaks, his voice soft and raspy. He figured it out, Mariner. Beckett takes a step toward him, ignoring the pang deep in her chest at the fact he's returned to using her last name. It already feels wrong, too formal on his tongue. How? Will half snorts, half laughs, his voice teeming with resentment. Oh, like it matters now. Beckett swivels to face him. What do you mean? She turns to Brad. What does he mean? Brad opens his mouth again, but he falters when he looks at her, his lips parted like he can't quite get the words out. He's whiter than Beckett's ever seen him. Tell her, Will says. Tell me what? Brad doesn't say anything. He just looks at her, still and stupid, and part of Beckett wants to run again, to turn on her heels and leave, like she could have done 100 times tonight, to get as far as she can from his sweaty hands and parted lips and the words he isn't saying before he says them, because then she'd never have to know, and nothing would change. But again, Beckett's feet don't move. Tell her, Will says again. Tell me what? Beckett's voice is verging on desperation now. She can't help it. It's like the silence is a breath she can no longer hold, like the thought itself is threatening to beat its way out of her chest. It's like she almost wants him to say it, what she's terrified of him saying, what she's been yearning for him to say all night. Will, Brad mutters, gazing desperately at Will, an ocean of understanding lapping between them. Please. Will ignores him, taking a step towards Beckett, and it makes Beckett want to strangle him, to shove him to the side and grab Brad by the hand again and lead him somewhere better. But she has to know. Maybe she can't go another second of her life not knowing. Tell me what? Will meets her eyes, and, for the first time, Beckett realizes she recognizes the unfamiliar glint in his expression, the thing that makes him not Brad. It's regret. That you're not the only one who's been in love since Tolgana the Four, Will says. And then, with a final glance at Brad, he pushes past Beckett and disappears into the night. Brad doesn't say anything for several eons. Neither does Beckett. They only stand there, wrapped up together in the cool, recirculated darkness. Brad slowly opening and closing his mouth like a freshly caught fish. The thoughts are twisting through Beckett's head too fast to grab a hold of. The scheme, the dance, Tulgana the Four, the way Brad had looked at her after, big-eyed and pale like the moon. A part of her still wants to run away, but the rest wants to run towards him, to crash into him in a wave of warmth and fizz and vulnerability, to feel the heat of his chest and wrap him up in her arms and press his stupid, idiotic, parted lips to hers. It almost hurts, the pulling of her gut, the want trying to claw its way out from the inside. But Brad stays silent, twisting his fingers around and around, as if he's tying and untying an invisible knot in his hands. Eventually, his fingers stop, and Brad looks up. I just wanted to piss him off. I didn't think you'd say, but he's wrong. You don't actually. Beckett takes him in, his rustled hair and crumpled brow and custom-replicated cufflinks, and nothing has ever felt less true. Obviously, she says. I was just saying that to mess with him. Brad bashes his knuckles together. Yeah. And Will is just trying to get back at me for embarrassing him. So he just made up like he didn't actually mean. Right, Beckett says quickly. I know. Of course. Good, Brad says. Okay. They stand there for another moment, in the dim-lit hallway, the steady beat of the warp core droning on as Beckett tries to piece together the sensations from the night in her head. And Will knows now, Brad says, and he'll tell everyone else. So we don't have to pretend anymore. What a relief, Beckett says flatly. Brad's eyes search her face as he nods, slowly. But even though Will's long gone, and the scheme is over, and there's nobody around to see them, Beckett leans forward and plants a kiss at the corner of his lips, grinning at the way the tips of his ears burn red. Come on, she says, taking his hand. Let's go home.